It's great to be with you again. A treat to be over here. And I bring you the greetings of the church I serve, Highbury Baptist Church. Last week, we looked at a woman. And today we're going to look at a woman in Matthew's Gospel. But it's a different woman. We're in Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. If you've got a church Bible, you'll find it on page 982. Page 982, Matthew chapter 15. And I'm just going to read from verse 21 to verse 28. So it's a shorter reading. And it's entitled there, The Faith of a Canaanite Woman. So Matthew chapter 15, verse 21. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. But what a story that we're looking at this evening. This encounter between Jesus and the Canaanite woman. There is nothing quite like it in all the Gospels. In a way, it's rather shocking. Does Jesus really begin by ignoring this woman who comes to him for help in her desperate situation? And what about his language? I mean, it would be hardly uncommon for Jews to dismiss Gentiles as inferior dogs. Gentiles is the Bible's term for non-Jews, for everyone else. It would be hardly uncommon for Jews to dismiss Gentiles as inferior dogs. But does Jesus really use such offensive, such seemingly racist language? Did Jesus really say that? You know, there's a view in some academic circles that the early church invented the stories about Jesus. I mean, stories like this would make a nonsense of that theory. Who would invent this? And does this untaught Gentile woman really out-argue Jesus? What a fascinating story. What lessons it has to teach us. I remember preaching on this very passage about 10 years ago. And it made a very deep impression on me, the preparation for it and the preacher, whether or not anyone else was impacted, certainly did me good. And some things changed for me that week, which have stayed different ever since. My prayer is that it will have the same effect on you. So here's the plan. First, we're going to look at Jesus' strange response to this woman and what explains it. We'll spend most of our time on that. And then we'll look at the woman's request and what characterizes it. Finally, we'll highlight 4 lessons for each of us to take away. So Jesus' strange response and what explains it, the woman's request and what characterizes it, and then 4 highlights, 4 lessons for each of us to take away. Firstly, then, there's Jesus' strange response. Verse 21 sets the scene. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Jesus has just clashed with the religious leaders from Jerusalem. He's just denounced them, denounced their religion, He's been scathing in his exposure of their reliance on human tradition, on their hypocrisy, on their innovation, sort of inventing things in worship, their focus on external things, whereas God is interested in the heart. He's denounced them as false teachers, as blind shepherds, and unsurprisingly, they were offended. So here is Jesus withdrawing. Here is Jesus stepping back from the decisive confrontation. That is going to come. Jesus knows it. There is going to be a showdown. But now Jesus is stepping back from that. He's moving out to the fringes. He's over the borders into Gentile territory, and he's out of the public gaze. But he can't escape notice. Verse 22, a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Why does she call him Son of David? We know that his human father was Joseph. That was the man in the house as he grew up. That was Mary's husband, even though not biologically his father. Why Son of David? Well, David had been the great king 1,000 years before. David had been the shepherd David the giant slayer, David the first king in this line of kings, this lineage, David the father of Solomon the wise, greatest king of Israel. And God had promised to send a king again, a king who would put things right, one who we call the Messiah, and he would be a son in David's line. And others in their need had addressed Jesus that way, as the King of the Jews, as the Messiah. And so this lady does too. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus did not answer a word. The first response she gets is a stony silence. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." Now, maybe we might assume that they're harsh, that they're just unfeeling, just tell her to go. But I think that there's another possibility. I think they may be saying, well, just give her what she wants. Just heal her daughter. Just send her away, heal. And they knew what Jesus was capable of. And that would make more sense of Jesus' answer. They say, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Just heal the demon-possessed daughter. And Jesus says, "I wasn't sent for Gentiles. Sent for the lost sheep of the house of Israel." They say, just give her what she wants. And Jesus says, or Jesus won't. And the implication is that all of this is said in her hearing. Verse 25, the woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. And then we get the strangest words of all. In verse 26, he replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." It's picture language, but the meaning is painfully clear. The Jews were God's chosen people. When God rescued them from Egypt over 1,000 years earlier, God had said, "Israel is my chosen son." They were the children of Abraham. Now, many Jews had misinterpreted that chosenness as if they were somehow intrinsically special, somehow more deserving. They saw themselves as a light, a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish. And so they sort of looked down on the other nations. They, the Jews, were the children, God's children, and by comparison, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, were dogs. And now Jesus is taking that sort of language on his lips. Now, dogs in Jesus' culture were not pampered pets. They weren't cute puppies. on the front of birthday cards or internet memes. No, dogs were nasty scavengers. It wasn't a term of endearment. I remember going to Peru. We went to Peru for a few weeks and we were walking through shanty towns, and they used to say, if you see a dog, you pick up 2 stones, and the dog knows you mean business, and from there on things may go better for you. And that was, dogs were either guard dogs or they were scavengers. This was not a term of endearment. Jesus appears insensitive and downright rude. It all seems so out of character. What explains it? What explains it? Well, I think there are 2 things that we can rule out. 2 things that don't explain it. The first thing I think that we can rule out is we can say that this wasn't racism and this wasn't social prejudice. Now, why do I say that? How can we be so sure? Well, because everywhere else, Jesus is remarkably comfortable with breaking social taboos. Back in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus welcomes a centurion. Centurions were not the flavour of the month. They were the enemy. They were the occupying forces. Jesus welcomes the centurion. And again, back in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus touches a leper. A leper you don't touch. And yet Jesus does. He crosses over all of those taboos, all of those boundaries. In John chapter 4, Jesus stays in a town of Samaritans. It's the very last thing that a Jew would do. And indeed, Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. That would be rather like telling the parable of the Good Conservative at a Labour conference. It's not going to go down well. It's not going to garner enthusiasm from your audience. So it wasn't racism. It wasn't social prejudice. Jesus was as far away from that as anyone could ever be. He saw people for what they were. And then I think, secondly, we can say it wasn't just irritation. It wasn't just irritation. How do we know that? Well, it's clear from everything else we see of Jesus in the Gospels. Just flick back to chapter 14 and chapter 14. Chapter 14, John the Baptist is beheaded. And it seems that certainly a closeness between Mary and Elizabeth, Jesus' mother, John's mother. Maybe they even grew up knowing each other. John was the forerunner of the Kingdom of God movement. Jesus was the successor. John is beheaded. That's not encouraging. So for all sorts of reasons, this was a tough time for Jesus. Verse 13 of chapter 14, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Let's get some space, get some time. His disciples are too busy. There's too many pressures on them. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he said, "Okay then, boys, back in the boat." Not if you're following. When Jesus lands and sees a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed those who were ill. This is how Jesus responds to interruptions to his plans, to his schedule. Responds with compassion, responds with love, consistently, always. It's one of the things that makes Jesus different from us. Sometimes we manage, sometimes we don't, with interruptions. I don't know how you are. But Jesus was so gracious, so kind. And so I think we can say, I know we can say, this in chapter 15 is neither racism, it's neither social prejudice, it isn't just irritation. We're the irritable ones. Jesus is supremely patient and compassionate. So then what does explain it? We've ruled out 2 things. What does explain it? Well, I think that there are 2 factors, 2 things that do explain it. And people who comment on the passage tend to focus on one or the other, but I think it's a combination of both. So let me tell you what they are. I think firstly, Jesus is deeply aware of his Father's plan and his Father's timetable. Okay? Jesus is deeply aware of his Father's plan and his Father's timetable. Jesus already foresaw a multiracial people of God. That is absolutely crystal clear back in the incident I mentioned about the centurion in chapter 8, when the centurion comes to Jesus for help, and Jesus goes, and the centurion sends a delegation, says, look, I wasn't expecting you to come. You could just say it, because you say things and they happen. Like me in the army, I say stuff and it happens. And you say stuff and it happens. You don't need to come to my house. If I tell the soldiers in the barracks to do something, I don't need to go, and it just happens. I get this. And Jesus, he says, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and he said to those following him, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside. So Jesus already foresaw a multiracial people of God. There were these great promises, the promise of the ingathering of the Gentiles, but all of that lay beyond Easter. It's in Matthew chapter 28, the end of Matthew's gospel, that Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. That's post-Easter. At the moment, in Matthew chapter 10, we read in verse 5, the 12 disciples, Jesus sending them out, these 12, Jesus sent out with the following instructions: do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. See the same idea. This is the agenda. This is what's happening now. The gospel is going out not to the Gentiles, not to the Samaritans, but it's going out to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus is aware of that. Jesus is not just a travelling healer, sort of rocking up here or there and dealing with whatever he meets. He's on a mission. Chapter 15 and 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The nations would be blessed, but when and only when Israel was redeemed. Only then would Gentiles become children. Here's how Paul puts it later in Galatians and chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 13, Paul is reflecting on God's agenda, his time scale, and he says this: Christ redeemed us, the Jews, Jewish believers, from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is anyone who is hung on a pole, on a tree. He redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Galatians 4 and verse 4, but when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, like the Jews, under the law, under the Sinai covenant, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. And because you are his sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. We've got this. This is the dynamic. If you think about the whole Bible story, think of it as a tree. Okay, so the very beginning of the Bible is the roots, Genesis chapter 1 to 11, and it's really wide. It's about all the nations. It's about the whole world. And then Genesis chapter 12, it suddenly becomes really narrow, and God chooses Abraham. And then the focus from then on pretty much is on Abraham, Abraham's son, Abraham's grandsons, Abraham's family, and all the way through the whole of the rest of the Old Testament. The focus is on Abraham's family. And really, when there's stuff about Gentiles, it's as they relate to Abraham's family. You learn about them because they're either joining the Jews or fighting the Jews, or they're being carrying the Jews off into exile. But the focus is on Abraham's family. It's like this tree. And that's where we still are in the Gospels. And it's only on the day of Pentecost that it starts to branch out, and we're back into the whole world. I mean, back in Genesis 12, God says, in you all the nations will be blessed. God was thinking about the branches, and he was thinking about the whole world. But that was the agenda, that was the trajectory, and that's where we still are in the Gospels. Jesus says that don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans. Not because God isn't interested in them. It's just timing. It's just that. So I think that's one of the explanations. Jesus had withdrawn to those parts, not to branch out, but to seek privacy. Mark's account is explicit. In Mark's account, Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know. It's not right. Well, let's do mission to Gentiles now. let's just get quietly somewhere, out of the public eye. In fact, in Mark's account of this story, Mark chapter 7, Jesus says, let the children be fed first. Jesus knows what's going to happen. So I think that's the first factor. Jesus, deeply aware of his Father's plan and timetable. But I think the second factor is this, that Jesus is leading this woman out. He's leading her on to deeper understanding and greater faith. Verse 22, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. Well, what does she mean by Son of David? Simply to catch the attention of this Jewish teacher, as others had done? Catch his attention by sort of acknowledging him as the Jewish Messiah? But if he's the Jewish Messiah, what has that to do with her? She's not Jewish. She's a Gentile. She's an outsider. She can't come to him on those terms. So in verse 25, the woman came and knelt before him. Lord, help me. She drops the Son of David. She's approaching him simply on the basis of her need. Master, Lord, help me. And then we have those striking words. In verse 26, he replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. It's underlying the fact that she's not Jewish. It's underlining, isn't it? Can't take the children's bread. Children, Jews, can't toss it to the dogs, Gentiles. Now, is Jesus simply adding insult to injury? Or was there a quizzical eyebrow raised, as it were? Something in Jesus' demeanour that had already hinted that this was not going to be his last word on the subject. Am I just the Jewish Messiah? Or is there something more? One writer puts it like this. He says, a good teacher may sometimes draw out a pupil's best insight by a deliberate challenge which does not necessarily represent the teacher's own point of view. We use the phrase devil's advocate, though that seems hardly appropriate in this context. Jesus is like the wise teacher who allows and even indeed incites the pupil to mount a victorious argument against his own adopted reluctance. You know, these are the thrusts of a verbal fencing match between Jesus and the woman. So Jesus is deeply aware of his Father's plan and timetable, and he's leading this woman on to deeper understanding, to greater faith. There's this great moment in C.S. Lewis's Prince Caspian. I don't know if you've heard of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, a story by an English professor, first at Oxford, then at Cambridge. He wrote The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It was part of 7 stories for children, and one of them is called Prince Caspian. And there's a character, the king of the beast, Aslan, in the story. And then there's a mouse called Reepy Cheep. And they have this argument, this discussion. And in the end, Aslan says to the mouse, you've conquered me. You win. And you sort of say, did the mouse really conquer the lion? Well, only because the lion wanted that. He willed it. So that's Jesus' strange request. But I want us to ask now, then, Jesus' strange response. I want us to now to ask, what can we say about this woman's request? Well, it was heartfelt, wasn't it? It was urgent. Verse 22, Lord, Son of David, my daughter is suffering terribly, demon-possessed. Or verse 23, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. It was heartfelt. It was humble. She was seeking mercy. She was kneeling. In verse 25, the woman came and knelt before him. And above all, it was undaunted. It was persistent. We start with verse 23. Jesus did not answer a word. Rather than take his silence as a no, she continues while she has an opportunity. She's not going to depart until she has an answer. He hasn't said no, so she's still there. But then verse 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. His words seem to be closing the door. She keeps knocking. And after all, he hasn't sent her away, so she's still there. But what about verse 25? 26, sorry. He replied, verse 26, he replied, she says, Lord, help me, he replies, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. And this seems to be the most discouraging rebuff of all. But in it, she glimpses hope. She sees something in it. It's very interesting when you look at verse 27. Most people take verse 27 as a sort of submission to Jesus. It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs, as if she's sort of agreeing with Jesus, but then asking for sort of a loophole. Yes, you're right, but make an exception. But actually, her words are more feisty than that. He says it's not right, and she says, yes, it is. It is right. For the reason is because, it's not there in our translation, it's there in the Greek, because even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. See what she's done? It's very subtle. Jesus said the dogs, and she picks up the language. Whose dogs are they? So these dogs under the table, well, they're the masters. They belong to the leaders in the house, the people who are in charge. Dogs we may be, but we're house dogs then. The children eat first, and after that, the dogs after. I get that, but that's not how it works, is it, Jesus? Kids play with the food, goes off the table, dogs are under. So it's not all waiting till they've got down. Even as the children eat, crumbs fall. Who would begrudge that? Particularly, we might add, when the children start to play with their food, when they reject it. Is there not an abundance at the Lord's table? Isn't there enough for all? The Jews may be the children, the Gentiles may be the dogs, but they're still his dogs. He is Lord. And so we have the happy outcome in verse 28. Then Jesus said to her, woman, you have great faith. You win. Your request is granted. She gets her answer. The future breaks into the present, as it so often did in Jesus' ministry. And there's no suggestion that Jesus grants her request reluctantly. It's quite the opposite. She's warmly commended. It's like when Joseph, you know the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers? See, it seemed pretty tough until then, isn't it? First he's harsh, your slaves, puts Simeon in prison, sort of, thundercloud face. But then, when he reveals himself, it's all smiles, it's open. You find this is the real Joseph. This is how he really feels. And so it is here. Suddenly the clouds are gone and the sun shines. She has acknowledged him as her master, and suddenly she finds herself not under the table, but seated at it. Seated there, as Jesus said would be the case back in chapter 8 and verse 11. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of God. So then, what's your take home? 4 encouragements for you to take away this evening. Number 1, there is hope for the most unlikely. There is hope for the most unlikely. Verse 21, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were traditionally enemies. This is, if you know your Old Testament, this is Jezebel country. Jezebel was bad news for Israel. And then verse 22, a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him. Technically, she was a Syrophoenician. That's what Mark calls her. Matthew's Canaanites. And that's evoking all of the negativity from the Old Testament. Canaanites under a curse, wicked, child sacrificing, driven out, show no mercy. She's a woman, second-class citizen in that society. Not in Jesus' book, but in that society. And she's a Gentile dog. And yet she gets a blessing. There is hope for the most unlikely. And that is good news for all of us. Which of us deserves God's blessing? I'm going to put the hand up. I deserve God's blessing. Perhaps you think there's every reason why God should ignore you. Past failures. Background. Present mess. There's hope for the most unlikely. Come to Christ, as she did. Verse 22, a Canaanite woman from the vicinity came to him. Verse 25, the woman came. Come first for yourself, and then come for others. Come humbly, seek mercy. There's hope for the most unlikely. It's easy to write people off. they would never be saved. There's hope for the most unlikely. Number 2, take home. Fervent prayer is born of desperation and faith. Where does fervent prayer come from? What gives it birth? It's desperation and faith. What drove this woman? Verse 22, a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Literally, it says, my daughter is badly demon-possessed. I mean, how can you be badly demon-possessed? Surely demon-possessed is pretty bad. She's badly demon-possessed, suffering terribly. And these two things. First, there was need. Need springing from love. This mother's anguished love at her daughter's plight. But it's not just need, it's also faith. Prayer is like assisted childbirth. I've got 2 daughters here. I'm not going to say which of them or my other daughter it is, but one of our 3 daughters was born with help. Ventouse. That's where I pull you out, like forceps, but with a suction, and the baby comes out with a sort of dome on your head. And you think, no way, they're going to look like an alien. And it goes down within 24 hours. But it's push and pull. That's how it works. And so it is here, push and pull. Need was the push, faith was the pull. Verse 28, woman, you have great faith. Faith in Jesus' ability. Faith in Jesus' compassion, despite all of the obstacles, all of the appearances. Great faith, unusual faith, like chapter 8. Fervent prayer is born of desperation and faith. Are your prayers fervent? Are they heartfelt? Are they persistent? Maybe we need a greater sense of need. Maybe we need a greater love. Maybe we need to reflect more on Jesus' ability, that he can help. Verse 28c, her daughter was healed at that moment. I mean, Matthew mentions it's almost in passing. It's clearly not the focus of his story. And her daughter was healed at that moment. Well, obviously, it's Jesus. And we think, wow, that is incredible. That's astounding. What power. His ability and his compassion. You need to get hold of that compassion, even if everything in the situation seems to say otherwise. Fervent prayer is born of desperation and faith. That's the vital combination. Number 3, hope for the most unlikely. This combination of desperation and faith. Number 3, delayed answers are for our good. Delayed answers are for our good. Verse 23, just send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. Just give her what she wants. But Jesus won't. And so she comes. And so she learns. She learns her position. She learns Jesus' lordship. It seems that Jesus is delaying precisely so that she learns to approach him as Lord of the world, not just as the Jewish Messiah. Delayed answers may be so that God can teach us good lessons. So we have in 1 Peter and chapter 1 and verse 6, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. The delay is for your good. The Puritan commentator Matthew Henry writes, when the answers of prayer are deferred, God is thereby teaching us to pray more and pray better. That's what he wants. God hasn't answered it because he wants you to pray more. He wants you to pray better. Now, that's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? That's a hard lesson to learn. God has reasons for his silence, for his discouragements, for his rebuffs. All things work together. Maybe he won't answer yet because he has more to teach you first. We know that from Lamentations chapter 3 that God doesn't willingly afflict. God takes no delight in stretching out the pain and the weight and the delay. God's not like that. We know that. So there must be a reason. There was clearly a reason here with this woman. And then fourthly and finally, we've seen hope for the most unlikely. Fervent prayer is born of desperation and faith. Delayed answers are for our good. And finally, earnest prayer may secure a blessing. earnest prayer may secure a blessing. This is a great encouragement for you to persist. Persist in praying for your children. Persist in praying for your younger siblings. Persist in praying for your parents, your friends, your colleagues, whatever it might be. Keep praying. Their situation may not be so obviously dark and bad as this girl, but they're in darkness. He was a mother who kept praying for her daughter. Are there any mothers, fathers in this situation? You need some fuel to encourage you just to keep praying for this loved one of yours. And let's pray, let's persist in our prayer for Satan's dupes all around us. We will be just the same. This is how Isaiah puts it. Striking words in Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 20. Such a person feeds on ashes. A deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself or say, is not this thing in my right hand a lie? He's worshipping this idol. He's looking for satisfaction or security or significance from his work or his relationships or his pornography or his achievements or his power or whatever it is. And he just can't see it for what it is. He's deluded. He can't say, look, it's a lie. Should we have compassion? Should we persist in our prayers? I wonder if you feel that the Lord is not answering, just ignoring you. I wonder if you read stuff in his word and it even seems to dissuade you and put you off. Will you persist? Don't be put off till you have an answer. Seek encouragements in his words, even if you have to work hard to do so. I can get an encouragement out of this word which seems so discouraging. I wonder if you know the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 32. It's a shocking. It's Moses. God has just rescued the people from Egypt. He's brought them out. He's brought them to Mount Sinai. He's given them the instructions for the tabernacle. He's given them the instructions for the law. They're just sort of like honeymoon. Israel has an affair on the honeymoon. Idol builds a golden calf, and God is livid, rightly so. And so Moses is called up the mountain, or he's still up the mountain, and God says to him in verse 10, I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. That's not very encouraging, is it? It's not very positive. Can you find something in there to encourage you? Well, Moses did. Leave me alone. Moses says, well, it means he can't destroy them until I leave him alone. So I won't. So he continues, he perseveres. Do you see? He's got something which seems so discouragement, but he found a loophole, just as the woman did, to persevere. Or take Jacob. The story of Jacob in chapter 32. Jacob is returning home, and he finds out his brother's coming to meet him. That's nice. With a small private army. Because when he left his home many, many years, 20 years earlier, he left with his brother breathing threats that he was going to kill him. So Jacob finally coming home. Here's Esau coming, and he finds out about this, and he's in a bad way, and then it just gets worse, because in the middle of the night, someone comes and attacks him and starts wrestling with him. Just one more problem? This man wrestling, or is it the key to blessing? Jacob realizes that this isn't just a man. God himself commands us. God tells us, give me no rest. Nag me. Do you know, you don't usually get that permission, do you? Usually it's the other way around. Don't nag me. You know, it says, I've said I'll do it. Do you know, you don't need to remind me every 6 months. That's the husband, isn't it? But God is saying, nag me. Don't give me no rest. It says that, Isaiah 62. Earnest prayer may secure a blessing. And it's a great encouragement that you may secure a blessing even out of season. It's easy to say it's not our time for blessing. Maybe it was in the past. Maybe it will be in the future. But not now. And we may be right. I often think of the UK. Squandered our heritage. So much that we had. So much blessing over so many hundred years. And now we're doing this. as much as we can to get rid of it as fast as we can, we're under judgment. So we're following the Romans chapter 1 trajectory. That may be true. There may be striking blessing in other parts of the world, China, parts of Africa, South America, in Iran, but not in Europe, not in the UK. It's not our time. But then it wasn't her time for blessing. Her time for blessing was after Pentecost. She faced every disadvantage, every discouragement, and yet she conquered. A great encouragement that you may secure a blessing, even out of season. What are Jacob's words? There's so many passages I'd love to go to, and we've run out of time. Jacob, when he gets into this fight, and he realizes this is no mere man, and the man says, "Let go of me," and Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Have you ever had that note in your prayers? I will not let you go unless you bless me. Why not now? Why not now onwards? Amen.